The problem addressed in Plato's account of representational reality emerged from a persistent instability in early Greek thought concerning the relationship between knowledge and appearance. This is before logic, a history of rules before they were written. Philosophical inquiry inherited a world in which sensory evidence produced conflicting descriptions without a clear mechanism for adjudication. Objects appeared to change while remaining identifiable. Properties varied across instances without losing conceptual continuity. At the same time, certain forms of reasoning produced results that did not vary with circumstance. Geometry and arithmetic yielded conclusions that remained fixed regardless of material conditions or observer perspective. This divergence generated a structural tension that could not be resolved through refinement of observation alone. Earlier philosophical traditions approached this tension in incompatible ways. Accounts emphasizing constant change undermined the possibility of stable definition. Arguments denying change rendered experience epistemically unreliable. Neither position provided a workable basis for classification, instruction, or governance. Reasoning required reference points that did not dissolve under variation. Without such reference points, disagreement could not be constrained by argument, and instead defaulted to authority, tradition, or force. Plato's sustained engagement with geometry must be understood within this context. Geometric reasoning demonstrated that certain relations remained invariant despite imperfections in their physical representations. No drawn figure achieved exact proportionality, and no measurement was free from error. Yet geometric relations themselves remained stable. The internal angles of a triangle did not vary with the quality of the drawing. Ratios persisted independently of the materials used to approximate them. This stability did not arise from sensory regularity, but from abstract relational structure. This insight carried methodological consequences. Physical artifacts deteriorated, varied, and accumulated error. Stone wore down, tools deviated, and measurements drifted. Yet the relations governing proportion did not degrade. A circle traced imperfectly still referred to a relation that remained unchanged across contexts. Plato treated this difference as epistemically decisive. If reasoning relied on what degraded, it could not remain stable. If it relied on what remained invariant, it could support consistent judgment across time and place. The theory of forms emerges from this representational pressure rather than from metaphysical speculation alone. Forms function as stable reference structures that permit classification and definition, despite variation among particulars. An instance may differ across circumstances, but the concept governing it must remain fixed if reasoning is to proceed. Without such stability, evaluation collapses into description. The forms therefore operate as constraints on meaning. They delimit what can count as an instance of a concept prior to empirical judgment. Within this framework, sensory experience is not rejected, but subordinated. Appearances are treated as incomplete presentations of underlying structure. They are intelligible only insofar as they participate in relations that are not themselves perceptible. Knowledge does not accumulate through exposure to instances alone, but through recognition of what remains constant across them. This recognition requires abstraction rather than observation. The allegory of the cave formalizes this representational hierarchy. Its function is organizational rather than narrative. Shadows correspond to sensory appearances that preserve only limited aspects of the structures that produce them. They retain outline while discarding relation, proportion, and internal differentiation. What appears is not false, but reduced. It carries insufficient structure to support reliable judgment. The cave therefore represents a condition of representational loss. Sensory perception presents effects without revealing their governing relations. Depth, proportionality, and causal structure are obscured. What remains is a flattened presentation incapable of supporting stable explanation. The ascent described in the allegory is not an accumulation of additional perceptions, but a shift in explanatory reference. Knowledge increases as reasoning becomes less dependent on appearances and more aligned with the relations that generate them. This shift introduces constraints on permissible explanation. Accounts that appeal solely to appearance are insufficient because they cannot explain invariance. Definitions must apply consistently across contexts. Categories must exclude what they do not contain. Contradiction signals representational failure rather than complexity within reality itself. These requirements limit reasoning before any method of formal proof is introduced. Educational practice within this framework reflects these priorities. Instruction is conceived as alignment with intelligible structure rather than transmission of information. Mathematical training occupies a central role because it disciplines attention toward invariant relations. Dialectical inquiry functions as a method for testing conceptual coherence rather than persuasion or debate. In this context, dialectic is not conversational in purpose. It operates as a procedure for exposing instability within definitions. Concepts are subjected to application across varied cases in order to determine whether they preserve consistency. When a definition fails under application, it is not treated as partially incorrect, but as structurally inadequate. It lacks the stability required to function as a reference point. This procedure does not generate new knowledge through synthesis, but stabilizes existing concepts by removing what cannot be preserved. Through repeated application, elements that introduce contradiction are discarded. What remains is not an enriched description, but a reduced structure capable of remaining consistent across circumstances. The process refines concepts by subtraction rather than accumulation. This method of refutation, known as elenchus, functions as a systematic test of conceptual resilience. Definitions are exposed to counter instances, not to defeat them rhetorically, but to determine whether they can sustain application without collapse. A concept that fails under such pressure is not adjusted superficially, but rejected as unsuitable for use in reasoning. Only those definitions capable of withstanding contradiction remain admissible. The Academy functioned in this sense as a site for systematic constraint testing. Concepts were evaluated according to their capacity to remain coherent under application. Before political structures could be justified, the conceptual materials used to describe justice, authority, and obligation had to demonstrate internal stability. Linguistic and logical materials were treated as load-bearing elements whose failure would compromise any system constructed upon them. The political implications follow directly. Authority is justified through proximity to stable structure rather than through success or assent. Governance becomes an epistemic problem. Decisions are evaluated according to their conformity with definitional constraints rather than their immediate outcomes. This orientation privileges stability over adaptability. Whether such governance is practicable remains historically uncertain, but its logical function is clear. This prioritization introduces rigidity. Once standards are abstracted from experience, they resist modification through empirical feedback. A rule aligned with structure may persist despite unfavorable results. This persistence is not an error within the system, but a consequence of its representational commitments. The ontological status of forms remains deliberately indeterminate in Plato's texts. They are described as stable and non-temporal, yet their mode of existence is not specified in empirical terms. Interpretations vary across later traditions. What persists is their functional role as constraints on representation. The cave allegory therefore marks a decisive moment in the history of reasoning. Representation becomes a problem to be managed rather than a mirror to be trusted. Logic emerges not as a tool for discovery, but as a means of regulation. It limits what can be said, defined, or inferred before it enables calculation. Plato does not eliminate uncertainty, he stabilizes it. By subordinating appearance to structure, he establishes conditions under which reasoning can proceed without collapsing into contradiction. This stabilization is provisional and historically contingent, but foundational. In the next episode, we will examine the Antikythera mechanism and analog computation in antiquity. We will consider how mechanical structure was used to stabilize calculation without formal symbolic logic.